In this video, we're going to use Fusion 360 Forms to create a spoiler for this AMG Mercedes. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, I'm going to take this data set here. This is a Mercedes AMG, and we're going to create a small spoiler off of the trunk. Now, I will say at this point, I am not going to provide this data set. I'm not going to provide the end result. This is simply going to be following along without the data set. Now, somebody sent me this. I don't exactly know where it came from, but I can tell that it was created. It's not a scan of a car. It was modeled in some sort of mesh modeling program. It's really high quality, looks great. And there are a lot of these types of models that you can download. Now, some of the things that we might want to do with this potentially would be to remove the emblem and clean it up, but I don't want to get bogged down by doing mesh manipulation. I really want to focus on the forms aspect of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how we would create a spoiler to fit this. And there are a couple different things that we should know, and I'm not going to cover all the different workflows. I'm mainly going to focus on the form tools, but note that we could use some mesh tools like Combine to use it to remove the spoiler and cut out the trunk lid and things like that. I don't want this video to be too long. I've actually done this video before and it was about an hour, and I really want to get a shorter version. So let's go ahead and jump in. I'm going to go to my solids tab and I'm going to create a form. For something like this, I like to start with either a face or a plane. Now, if we're creating something like a fender flare, using face can be handy because we can snap it to the mesh. But in this case, I want to use plane from the top, and I'm just going to draw it out here to the side. I'm going to make sure that I have length symmetry turned on, and because the model is centered about my origin, the symmetry line of my spoiler is already there as well. So this is a great starting point, and I should note that when I'm designing something like this, I make sure that I'm behind the mesh body because the software gets a little confused if it has different directions that it can push a mesh to. So we're going to use the technique of modeling outside of where we want and then pull it in closer. So first thing to do is I need to start moving it a little bit closer. And again, I don't want it to be perfect, but I want to just get it close to the right shape. Then I'm going to use the object to select the whole body, and I want to bring this up, and I'm going to rotate it to whatever angle I want. This is going to be a pretty mild spoiler. I'm going to try not to make it too big, but again, just kind of putting it in the right location, and then we'll pull it down closer later. I'm also going to go into box display mode. If you want to go to your selection options, you can do it here, and note the shortcut keys for me are Alt and 1 and Alt and 3 to go back and forth between smooth and box. I am also going to assume that you do have some forms experience, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on all the shortcut keys. I'm just going to go ahead and play around with creating the shape. So we're going to take this edge here and I'm going to move it in. I don't want it to go past the trunk. I want it to sort of end here, and I'm going to pull those in. Then I want to go to Modify, Insert Edge, and I'm going to put an edge right in the middle there. I'm going to take this edge, and I'm going to move it backwards. So what I'm looking to do is from this view, make it fairly straight. And again, in smooth display, you can see we're just sort of widening it here. And this is also a great time for us to make sure that the spoiler itself isn't too big. So I'm going to scale everything down. I'm going to use the body option. And again, I'm going to move it a little bit closer, making sure that I am staying away from the body because I'm going to use the tools to pull it toward that later. Go back to my All selection or Alt and F on the keyboard. And now we can start to tweak the shape a little bit. So right now it sort of bumps up in the middle and comes back down. I want to take this edge and I want to pull that up. This can be difficult to see. So sometimes you're going to have to work in sort of an isometric view and play with just moving things in plane. I think it's pretty close. It looks okay. Again, smooth display, box display. With that edge selected, I'm going to go to insert another edge. This time I'm going to put it a little bit closer. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to scale things down. So I can keep that wider section in the back and then I can taper it down on the side. So I'm going to do this again, modify, insert edge. This time I can put that one right in the middle. It'll be fine, but I want to scale it down. So edit form, Remember the tip about resetting our pivot point? I'm going to go to my side view, in this case right, and I'm going to scale down in plane. So I'm going to use this corner option. And if we rotate just a little bit, you can see what we're doing is we're scaling that down, making it narrower. I'm going to do the same thing to this outside edge. And I'm going to do these individually because if we selected both of them, the scale point is going to be a little tricky. But doing them individually will allow us to visually make sure that the lines make sense. If we go into smooth display, you can see it's a bit wider at the back and it's narrower here. So it's looking all right. It's probably a little bit bigger than I want in the middle. I'm going to make sure that I keep scaling the side down. I'm going to reset that pivot point. I'm going to scale this down a bit more. I'm going to double click to select that edge, set its pivot point, scale that down a bit more. Then I'm going to do the same thing over here. Now this is going to take a little bit of work. We're just going to go back and scale some of this stuff down. I'm going to double click this edge. And the reason I'm setting the pivot point where I am is because I'm scaling it toward the car. I want to keep this point relative to the car. That way I make sure that where I place the entire form body is not changing, only the overall thickness or the width is. So now you can see that looks a little bit better. The AMG deck lid, the way that these cars are shaped, it's pretty curved. So that's not really giving me that feel. It's looking very flat. So in order to get that, I want to start manipulating the shape a little bit. So I want to take these two edges, I'm going to pull them in closer to the car. And that should round it out a little bit. And then I want to take this edge here, and I'm going to pull that in just slightly. This edge here, I'm going to pull that one in slightly as well. That'll give me a little bit of shape to it. So it's still fairly flat in the back, but then it's sort of tapering down. If we want this taper to be more aggressive, then we can scale this edge down. I can use my reset pivot point and I can pull this one in or use scale again to bring it down just a little bit. And that'll give us a little bit more of a drastic scale there. We could play around with this a lot, and this is probably the time that you want to spend the most amount creating the shape that you're happy with. Because once we go past this stage, it becomes very tricky for us to go back and make changes. But I'm happy with this, and when I'm looking at this, what I'm doing is I'm sort of identifying the shape of the car. So if I pull this in a little bit, you can see that it's starting to not look quite right. And if I double click that, holding down shift and pull both of these in, that looks okay. It's giving me the curve that I want. But we need to go back and forth, and we need to work in box display and smooth display and sort of just manipulate these as needed. So I'm going to scale this one down a little bit. And then back in smooth display, that looks okay. From the side, I want to make sure that we are not too close to the car, but also not too far away. And if I want to introduce any curvature or any shape, for example, I could bring that edge up and give it a little bit of a lip. I can maybe move individual vertices if I want to accentuate that. And once we're happy with the general shape, that's when we're going to start to add a little bit more division. So I'm going to take this edge, I'm going to double click it, go to Insert Edge, put it right in the middle. And now this gives me another level of control. So what I can do is I can pull this down slightly, and this is going to give me more of a lip. So again, we want to be careful that we're not adding too much control too early, but once we get to a certain point, we want to start to begin to dictate that shape. So you can see now we've got sort of that little bit of a lip there. So as long as you're happy with the shape, then you can progress on to the next stage. So once we have this, the next step for me is to thicken this. Now, you might be wondering, why would I thicken this design? Why wouldn't I just create a surface and then do the thicken after it's converted back to a B-rep? Well, the main reason that we want to do it here is because we get control of the inside and the outside of the body. So if we go to Modify and Thicken, and we select this, what we want to do is we want to be very careful with how thick we make it. So I'm going to pull this down, and 5 millimeters is probably okay. I'm actually going to make it a little bit thinner. I'm going to say 3. I'm going to make sure the type is soft, which means that the edges will not be flat. They won't have a crease. It'll have a nice rollover. And the direction is going to be normal. That's normal to the curvature of the shape that we have here. So I'm going to say OK. And you can see it instantly rounded everything off. That's okay, but now is when we can go back and we can fix that. So we're going to go back to box display. And from the side, it doesn't really look like much. But what we want to do is we want to thicken the front edge where it's closest to the car. So I'm going to select that edge. I'm going to go to my right-hand view. I'm going to use Edit Form. And I'm just going to bring this down. When I do that, what I'm doing is I'm thickening that edge where it's going to intersect the car. Now, because we are going to be rolling over the trunk lid, I want to also pull it forward. I'm going to give it more of an angle. Now, ultimately, what we're going to do is we're going to move this entire thing closer to the car, figure out where we want it. But for right now, we're just sort of working on that shape. I'm going to say OK and take a look at this in smooth display. Now, again, it doesn't really look like very much. What I would suggest at this point is to consider putting a crease on this front edge and the ends here. So I'm going to select them all, go to Modify, and I want to add a crease. I'm going to say OK, and then when I look at this in smooth display, the part where it's going to be attaching to the car has a crease, and there are some problems that come up from that, but we're going to add more control in just a little bit. But once we're happy with the shape and the thickness here, then we can start to come in and add some more control. And the way that we do this is by inserting additional edges near the corners. So for example, if we want this corner right here, if I go to smooth display, you can see that it's pulled way over here. If we want to control that corner a bit better, what we need to do is we need to divide this section up, and we also need to have some more control in the middle here. So the order of operations that you choose is going to differ depending on the shape. For me, what I'm going to do first is I'm going to control the corner, and then I'm going to worry about the middle part. I'm going to do that part last. So the way that I would do this is first decide how far in this edge needs to go. So I'm going to take one edge, I'm going to go to Insert Edge, and notice that half puts it way in between that face, and I need to bring that way, way back. So if you want it to be a pretty tight transition, it's going to have to be pretty close. I'm going to repeat that process using my right-click marking menu, and I'm going to put it on this side, and again, pretty close. Now the trick here is that this has to carry somewhere. If we just go into smooth display, it doesn't look very good. And that's because we need to carry that curvature somewhere. So if I go to Insert Point, and let's go ahead and center this, and I bring this forward, for example, now what I'm doing is I'm starting to divide that shape up. If I repeat this and I do it on the bottom, then I need to carry it up and over this. And I'm going to say OK. Then I'm going to repeat that. And this time I'm going to go from the top to the bottom and say OK. So now if we take a look at this, we're getting a little bit better control of that edge because we added that curvature control. We haven't fixed this one here yet. That still needs a little bit of work, but you can kind of see what we're doing. Now, in order for us to do this one, it's a little bit more tricky. So I'm actually going to double click that entire top edge. I'm going to shift to deselect that. And because we have symmetry, and because we double click that edge, we'll have to go do it on the other side as well and just remove it. And then what I want to do now is insert another edge. So again, insert edge. You'll notice that we want it to go the other direction, so I'm going to say minus 0.05. That's probably a bit tighter than we need, so maybe minus 0.1, and then I'll say OK. Once we have that, we can use insert point, and we can just connect these two. We need to repeat that same process on the bottom. And one thing that we can do is, let's go ahead and hide the mesh body of the car. One thing we can do is we can select the edge here. We can rotate this around, find the one that's highlighted yellow, shift and double click it, and that'll automatically fill in the loop between it. So that way we don't have to deselect anything. Sometimes that saves a little bit of time, sometimes it doesn't really. Now this is going to be positive, so we're going to say 0.05. I should put it on the bottom if we rotate this around. That looks pretty good. And then once again, we need to connect it here. What you're going to find is you're going to have to do a little bit of work. Let's go ahead and rotate this around. You're going to have to do a little bit of work for where that edge actually ends up. So for example, this edge here, we might want to use modify and slide and pull it forward a little bit. And now that we have that, let's go into smooth display and just take a look. So from our side, I'm going to double click the mouse wheel. Now you can see that that corner looks pretty good. If I use Control and 4, you can see that God, this thing is so big, so every time I rotate it, sort of resets it. So you can see that that corner is looking pretty good. If we rotate this thing around at different views, you can see that it looks pretty good here. There's still a lot that has to be done, but this is a great starting point. The next thing that I want to do is I want to put some edges in the middle. So the middle is really going to help us because we want to control what happens there. So I'm going to say insert edge. And the handle is all the way over here, but I want to put it right in between. So that's going to be positive 0.5. And now what I need to do is I need to repeat that process here. Well, we can use insert edge, we can use insert point. Either is going to be fine. Insert point works okay because right in the middle we've got this red dot that sort of helps us. And then we can say okay there. And then we're going to have to repeat that by inserting an edge on the inside. You'll notice that it's trying to give us a full loop, but really all we want to do is go down the middle. So once again, we can either use insert edge or we can just simply pick a couple of those midpoints and add it there. Now let's go to smooth display and just take a look. So that corner is controlled a little bit better now. We've added some additional control that kind of helps it. Again, we're creasing this edge. We could spend a little bit more time and work so that we didn't have a hard edge there, but in the interest of time, I don't really want to get too bogged down with this. I do also want to make a quick note. I know that oftentimes watching videos on YouTube to try to learn something quickly can be appealing, but a process like this, there aren't really any shortcuts. It's going to take time. You're going to have to spend the time on all the little details. And even though this video at this point is 15, 16 minutes long, if I were to design this realistically, if I was going to 3D print it, or if I was going to try to manufacture it in some way, I would likely spend hours and hours doing all the little details. We can quickly get some results, but to really finalize the design, it would take several hours. What I want to do here is I want to begin crafting it so that it fits the car a little bit better. So I'm going to bring the car back. You can see right now that we're kind of above the car. And what I want to do is I'm going to modify, I'm going to choose body, and I'm going to move in plane, but I'm going to pull this down a little bit closer. And here is the tricky thing, because as I mentioned, we want it to be behind the car. So we did a lot of work initially to make sure that it was sort of close to the right shape. But for example, the Mercedes emblem here, that is going to be tricky. It's going to sort of lose its way when it's trying to push that on. So we do need to be extremely mindful of the mesh that we're working with. And for us, what I want to do is I want to take this inside edge. So I'm going to shift double click that. And I want to just push it back a little bit. I want to give it a little bit of curvature. So again, shift double click. It deselected it because my selection type was body. But now I'm just going to take this and move it up and back a little bit. And if we rotate this around, what we're doing is we're creating a little curve. And the reason we're doing that is because we really don't want it to get confused when it starts to try to push it to the body. So that looks pretty good so far. The last thing that I want to do is I want to restructure this so that it goes up and over the Mercedes logo. Now, in reality, what we would probably do is we would probably cut that out afterwards. We could omit it from trying to pull the vertices to the mesh. That's one way that we could do this. But in reality, probably the way that I'm going to do is I'm going to take this midline. I'm going to go to insert edge. I'm going to put it on both sides. Probably tighten it up a little bit and say, okay, this is going to change the shape of the spoiler a little bit. It's going to adjust it. If we go back into smooth display, you see it gives us sort of a little lip in the middle. If you don't want that, then you need to spend a little bit of time making sure that those, sorry, let's go ahead and move this down. Those vertices are more straight. For this, it's going to be okay. But the reason that I did this is because I want to pull the shape up a little bit. So I'm going to take this edge right here. I'm going to reset my pivot point right there. And I want to restructure this. I'm going to scale it down. So that way I give it this sort of little bump over the emblem. So just a very minor thing, but I wanted to go ahead and do that. And the other thing that I want to do is I'm going to take this inside edge and I want to manually pull it closer to the car. Now this can be tricky, but one thing that we can do is we can go to inspect and section analysis, and we're going to pick a plane. And when we do that, it's going to cut through the mesh, which is harder to see, but it's also going to cut through our form body. So we can kind of see inside of it. It's not perfectly centered, but that's okay. It helps us figure out a little bit more about what we need to move. So I'm going to select those two edges. I'm going to go back to a side view, and I'm going to pull them in closer to the car. What I really want to happen is I want that vertex to snap to this portion of the car, and I want this vertex to snap down here. And we do have one in the middle, and it's going to have to sort of pick where it's going to match. Now, in reality, what you would want to do is you would want to get that closest to the high point in the middle. So sort of move it around until you're happy with its location. And we could do this throughout the whole thing. Again, if I were going to work on making this, I would spend a lot more time tweaking and finessing these things. But what I want to do now that I've sort of tweaked and fixed the inside, I want to go ahead and just correct a few of these spots. So I'm just going to do it by vertex. I'm just going to move them. And if the scale is too drastic, then you can always zoom in, make it a little bit easier. I'm going to go ahead and take this one, pull it in just a little bit. And again, what we're looking for is a smoother transition. I'm actually going to take this entire edge, pull it a little bit closer to the car, go back to smooth display, make sure it isn't a drastic change. All right. So now at this stage, it's probably a good idea for me to save it since I haven't saved it at all. So I'm going to just go ahead and call this MB spoiler. And I'm going to hide the mesh body. I'm going to go to modify and pull. There are a lot of vertices in here. You can see that we've made some tweaks here. So what we need to do is we need to select them all. And what ends up happening is you want to be very careful that you don't select any through the face. So the selection filters oftentimes will change based on what you're doing. So by default, select through is probably on. And if you start box selecting, you'll notice that some of these green dots will end up inside. If that happens, then what you can do is you can hold down Control if you're on a PC and drag a box over that, and it'll deselect it for you. So I'm holding down Shift to add to my selection. And if you accidentally select too many, then you can hold down, again, you can hold down Control. So over here, I'm going to hold down Control and box select those to remove them from our selection set. Nothing's happening because the mesh wasn't there. As soon as we bring the mesh back, what it's trying to do is trying to auto project to the closest point. Now, depending on how much resolution you have, how many vertices you have, will dictate how close you actually get to this. So for us, we could use more to match that curvature, but I think this actually looks pretty good. So I'm going to say okay, and I'm going to hide the car. So you can see that it pulled those in. We can do a little bit more work, but what I want to do at this stage is I'm going to take that creased edge. I'm going to go to Modify and Bevel. I'm going to reduce this bevel value down to something pretty small, again 0.05, and maybe add 2 segments and say okay. And then I want to go to Modify and I want to uncrease. So anywhere that we have a creased edge, I'm going to double click to allow it to uncrease those. You might need to work your way all the way around the outside and make sure that it is grabbing everything. But let's say okay, and let's just take a look at this. If I hide the edges, so again, Control and 4, what we've done is we've created sort of a rounded corner here rather than just that sharp crease. But notice that I did this after I did the vertex to pull to this. You also notice that we're slightly inside of the car. And again, that's going to be based on the number of divisions that we have. If we have a ton of divisions, then what we end up getting is a better result. Now, you can kind of think of this like the mesh resolution. So there's a number of triangles here, and we're really going to need a very similar number of divisions to perfectly match the shape. I don't really want to add that many divisions, but again, as long as you progress naturally, you do a couple of divisions here and there, you get your shape right, then you can spend the time and you can actually get a number of divisions that makes it match perfectly. At this stage, if we want to change anything, then it's just going to get tricky. Now, we can do it by being very careful, by using box selections, by pulling things out, but notice at some point it removed symmetry. So these are also things that we need to be mindful of. So I'm going to select mirror internal. I'm going to go across these two faces, and notice that it's not picking it up. So if this happens to you, then sometimes it means that adding the bevel or potentially using pull overrode some of that. So again, I'm going to try to see if we can add mirror. Looks okay. And now if I want to make any tweaks or adjustments to the shape, I just need to be very careful with what I'm selecting. So box select, I'm going to pull all those out, take a look at it in smooth display, maybe pull them out a little bit more so it's closer to flat. And again, if these divisions are too much, you can zoom in or you can manually input them. And I'm going to take these, I'm going to zoom way in and pull them out just a little bit. And notice that I'm not bringing the whole thing. I'm leaving the edge at the car where it is. And again, that's going to help me tweak the shape a little bit. So at this stage, I'm happy with the results. I'm going to finish the form, which will convert it to a B-rep. Since it was closed, it's a solid body. If you spent the time and you made a number of divisions that was high enough that it perfectly matched your car, then you can go ahead and manufacture it, 3D print it, or add additional details, whatever you need to do. For us, since it's not a perfect match, we could also go the route of converting this solid body to a mesh and just using the car to remove it. It gets a little tricky, so I don't want to spend a bunch of time doing that, but just note that we have a nice clean B-rep surface. I can go to my appearances. I'm going to add some paint to the car. I'm going to go down to other. And under other, we should find carbon fiber. And I'll go ahead and drop a carbon fiber twill on there. And you'll notice that it looks pretty good. We're seeing the reflections. We're seeing everything on the car. I can go to my render workspace, allow it to start shading. And obviously, we could spend a lot more time making some adjustments here. We could do our texture map control, and when we do this, we can change the display mode to UV diagnostic. You can see that on the sides here, what we really end up having is more of a stretched look. So if we want to try something like a planar with a certain axis, or if we want to try a box, we can modify the density and we can increase that number. So when we say, okay, now we're getting carbon fiber laid out in a different orientation. So you can play around with these little things and get it to look just like you want it. But overall, I think I'm pretty happy with that. You can see that we were able to clear the logo. We have that shape that I was kind of looking for. I could spend more time tweaking it, but it does sort of match the way that AMG and Mercedes have been shaping these cars for the past number of years. It's probably a bit more aggressive or extreme than I would want to go, but again, that's the process. That was the main thing I wanted to cover, was how we would go about starting a form body like this, when we would add additional detail or control, and what the end result looks like. So if you have any questions, obviously, please let me know. Again, I will not be sharing this car model or the end result. Again, it was provided to me. It looks like it's been modeled in a 3D program. I don't know exactly where it came from, so I don't want to just freely distribute it. But again, a lot of these cars you can download. There are plenty of resources where you can find cars like this. But at this point, again, any questions, please let me know. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.